The silence in our home had become a third presence, a quiet, heavy thing that settled in the spaces between David and me. We moved around it, careful not to disturb it, for fear of what might be unleashed. Our life from the outside was the envy of our friends. The house was beautiful, the children were thriving, and David's career had reached a point where financial worry was a ghost from a distant past. But inside, I was drowning in a sea of quiet contentment. That's the trap, you see. No one suspects you're unhappy when your life looks so perfect. David wasn't a bad man. He was a good man, a reliable man. He was the kind of man who remembered to get the car serviced and who never missed a mortgage payment. But the man I married, the one who would surprise me with silly love notes and pull me into an impromptu dance in the kitchen, had slowly been replaced by a quiet, preoccupied stranger. Our conversations were a checklist of domestic logistics. We discussed the children's schedules, home repairs, and social obligations. We never discussed us. We never discussed the growing chasm that I felt widening with every passing polite day. I felt like a prized possession, well maintained and displayed, but no longer truly seen. The loneliness was a physical ache, a hollow space beneath my ribs that nothing seemed to fill. Volunteering at the art gallery started as a desperate attempt to find a piece of myself that existed outside of being a wife and mother. It was there I met Ethan. He was the new curator, a man with kind eyes and a disarming ease about him. Where David was structured and reserved, Ethan was fluid and open. He noticed the world in a way I had forgotten to. He noticed me. It began with conversations about art, about light and composition and the emotion behind a brushstroke. Then it evolved into conversations about books, about dreams, about the quiet disappointments of life. He asked me questions David hadn't asked in years. "What do you think, Sarah? How does that make you feel?" He listened to my answers as if they mattered. I told myself it was just a friendship, a harmless connection to stimulate a mind that had been left fallow. But the lies started small. I'd linger 15 minutes longer after my shift. I'd mention a lengthy gallery meeting to account for a coffee with Ethan. Each small deception sent a thrill through me, a guilty spark that made me feel alive for the first time in years. I was creating a secret world. And in that world, I was just Sarah, not Liam and Sophie's mom, not David's wife. The guilt was a constant companion, but it was overshadowed by the addictive need to feel valued, to feel interesting. The shift from an emotional connection to something more tangible was gradual, almost inevitable. It wasn't a passionate, reckless leap. It was a slow, quiet surrender, a touch on the hand that lasted a second too long, a meeting that accidentally turned into lunch, then a lunch that accidentally turned into a walk in the park. I knew I was crossing a line from which there was no return. But the pull was too strong. The affair became my secret life, a parallel existence where I wasn't lonely. I became an expert liar, crafting elaborate alibis with a skill that shocked me. I had a separate email account, a hidden messaging app. I lived in constant fear of discovery, but that fear was part of the addiction. It was around this time that I first sensed a change in David. It was subtle, almost imperceptible. He started asking more questions about my days at the gallery. Not accusatory questions, but interested ones. What exhibit are you working on now? Who else volunteers on Tuesdays? At first, I was flattered, thinking perhaps my newfound happiness was sparking a renewed interest in me. But there was a clinical quality to his curiosity. It felt less like interest and more like research. One evening, I came home flushed and a few minutes late from seeing Ethan. David was in the living room reading. He looked up over his glasses, his expression unreadable. "Good day?" he asked, his voice neutral. "Yes, busy," I said, my heart hammering. "We were framing the new pieces for the modern collection. Time got away from me." He nodded slowly, his gaze lingering on me. "You have a little smudge," he said, pointing vaguely to his own cheek. "Right there. Paint, perhaps." My hand flew to my cheek. There was nothing there. It was perfectly clean. A cold dread trickled down my spine. Was it a test? A simple observation? I forced a laugh. "Oh, must have been from the storage room. It's dusty in there." He simply nodded again and returned to his book. But the air in the room had changed. A seed of paranoid fear had been planted. From that day forward, I became hyper-aware of David's quiet presence. I started noticing little things. He was suddenly more helpful around the house, taking on tasks he'd always left to me. He began suggesting we go out for dinner, just the two of us. He started remembering tiny, insignificant details I'd mentioned weeks before and bringing them up in conversation. It was as if he was studying me, learning my routines, my patterns, my tells. The perfect life I had built began to feel like a beautifully decorated prison. And for the first time, I wondered if the warden had always been watching, waiting for me to make a mistake. The revenge, though I didn't know it yet, had already begun. It wasn't a shout. It was a silence. And it was far more terrifying. The paranoia that David had planted in me grew like a weed, twisting through my every thought and action. Every casual question he asked felt like a probe. Every silent moment, a judgment. I became a master of deflection. My lies more elaborate, my alibis more fortified. Yet the thrill of my secret life with Ethan was now tarnished by a constant low-grade fear. I was living on a knife's edge, and the pressure was immense. David, meanwhile, continued his transformation into the model husband. He was attentive, helpful, and engaging. He started planning a surprise weekend getaway for our upcoming wedding anniversary. 15 years is a milestone, Sarah, he said one evening over dinner, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "I've booked a palsy cabin by the lake, like we used to love. I thought we could use some time alone to reconnect." My heart sunk. A whole weekend alone with him, under his microscope, without the usual distractions of home and children. It sounded like a trap, but I couldn't refuse without raising more suspicion. I forced a smile and thanked him, all the while frantically messaging Ethan to cancel our plans for that weekend. The weekend arrived with an ominous stillness. The cabin was indeed beautiful, picturesque in a way that felt like a mockery of our strained relationship. The first day was unnervingly pleasant. We went for a walk by the lake, we cooked a meal together, and we even played a board game. David was charming, conversational, and seemingly genuine. He talked about his work, his hopes for the children's future, and even shared funny stories from his past. I began to relax, thinking that perhaps I had been imagining things. Maybe he truly was trying to save our marriage. The guilt I had been suppressing surged forth, and I felt a genuine desire to try to end things with Ethan and recommit to David. But that night, as we sat by the fireplace, the facade cracked. The conversation turned to the gallery. "That artist you've been working with," David began, sipping his wine casually. "Ethan, is it? He seems very talented. I looked up his past exhibitions online. His work is quite evocative." The use of Ethan's name, spoken so calmly in this intimate setting, sent a jolt of ice through my veins. I had never mentioned Ethan's name to David. I always referred to him as the curator or one of the volunteers. My mouth went dry. "Yes, he is," I managed to whisper. "He has a unique perspective on light and shadow." David continued as if discussing the weather. "Almost like he's capturing a secret world, don't you think?" I could only nod, my mind racing. How did he know? Had he been to the gallery website? It was possible, but his tone felt loaded, intentional. He was letting me know that he knew. The rest of the weekend was a torture of polite conversation and silent accusations. I was a prisoner in a beautiful cage, and David held the key. When we returned home, the tension in the house was palpable. A few days later, David approached me with his tablet in hand. His expression was grave but controlled. "Sarah, we need to talk about our finances," he said, his voice dangerously calm. "I've been reviewing the joint account statements. There have been several large withdrawals over the past few months, all marked for gallery renovations." My blood ran cold. I had been taking money, small amounts at first, then larger sums to fund my outings with Ethan, nice dinners, hotel rooms, even a small gift I had bought him. I had created fake invoices on my computer to justify the expenses to myself, never thinking David would actually check. "I called the gallery director today," David went on, his eyes locked on mine, "to see if they needed any further donations." She was quite confused. She said they haven't had any renovations in years, and they certainly haven't received any funds from us. I opened my mouth to speak, to lie, but no words came out. The evidence was irrefutable. The perfect, logical, methodical David had done his homework. He had caught me in the most tangible betrayal possible, stealing from our family. "The credit card statements make for interesting reading too," he continued, tapping the screen. "Dinner for two at the Oak Room on a night I was at a conference. 2 tickets to a symphony performance I never attended. A charge for a hotel in the city on a day you told me you were helping your mother." He placed the tablet on the table between us. "The story these transactions tell is very different from the one you've been living, Sarah." I broke down then. The weight of the deception, the guilt, the fear, it all came crashing down. I confessed everything between sobs. I told him about Ethan, about my loneliness, about how I felt invisible in our marriage. I begged for forgiveness, for a second chance for the sake of our children. David listened silently. He didn't interrupt. He didn't get angry. When I was finally spent, he spoke, his voice still eerily calm. "I want you to end it today. You will send him a message right now with me watching, telling him it's over and that you will never contact him again. Then
You will give me your phone." It was an ultimatum delivered with chilling precision. Defeated, I did as I was told. My hands shook as I typed the message to Ethan. A final cold goodbye. David read it, nodded, and watched as I pressed send. Then he took my phone, my connection to the outside world, and pocketed it. "What happens now?" I whispered, feeling utterly broken. "Now," David said, "we begin the process of managing this for the children. We will go to therapy. We will present a united front. You will not speak a word of this to anyone. Our life, the appearance of our life, will remain intact, but things will change." He outlined his terms. We would stay in the same house, but we would live separate lives. He was moving into the guest room. I would have a strict allowance for household expenses, but he would control all major finances. I was to be the perfect wife and mother in public, but in private, I was a prisoner on probation. I agreed to everything. I had no choice. I thought this was the punishment. I thought the humiliation and the loss of freedom were his revenge. I was wrong. This was just the beginning. David's revenge was not about anger. It was about control. And he was just getting started. He had me exactly where he wanted me, trapped in the perfect life I had betrayed, forced to watch as he systematically dismantled everything I held dear. The real revenge was yet to come, and it would be executed with a cold efficiency that would leave me with nothing but the echoes of my own mistakes. The therapy sessions were a meticulously staged performance, and David was the director. We would sit side by side in Dr. Evans' office, a portrait of a couple fighting for their marriage. David was brilliant. He spoke with a measured humility, acknowledging his own emotional absence, his failure to prioritize our connection. He sounded so reasonable, so wounded, yet willing to heal. When I spoke, my words were tangled in guilt and shame. I'd stumble over explanations, my voice thick with tears, while David would often gently clarify my points, subtly steering the narrative toward his prepared script. He was building an impeccable record of being the committed, betrayed spouse, while I was being framed as the incoherent, unstable adulterer. Dr. Evans' sympathetic nods increasingly went his way. I was losing the case in the one room where I thought I might find absolution. A month after our return from the cabin, David called me into his study. The desk, once a cluttered mess of his work papers, was now starkly neat. A single thin folder lay in the center.
"Sarah," he began, his tone that of a businessman addressing a disappointing partner. "I've given this a great deal of thought. The trust between us is irrevocably broken. However, my primary concern is, and always will be, the stability and well-being of Sophie and Liam." He opened the folder. Inside was a detailed, typewritten document. It outlined a plan for a legal separation, but not a public one. It was a blueprint for a continued lie. "You will remain in the family home," he stated, not asked. "To the outside world, especially to our children, nothing will change. We will have family dinners, we will attend school functions together, we will take our annual vacation as a family. However, our personal lives will be separate. I have already moved my belongings into the guest suite." He then presented a financial spreadsheet. It was chilling in its detail. A new individual account would be created for me. A generous monthly allowance would be deposited to cover household groceries, the children's incidental needs, and my personal expenses. All joint accounts, investments, and assets would be solely under his management. "This is to prevent any further financial discrepancies," he said, his gaze cold. I was being put on a stipend, like a child. I was to maintain the facade of our life, but I was to have no real agency within it. I agreed to everything. What choice did I have? I had signed away my rights with every lie I'd told. For 6 months, I lived this strange half-life. I was a ghost in my own home, playing the part of the happy wife for our children and friends, then retreating to the silence of my room, which felt more like a cell. David was cordial, even kind, in front of others. But when we were alone, the warmth vanished, replaced by a polite, impenetrable coldness. I thought this was my punishment, a life sentence of quiet humiliation. I was wrong. This was merely the calm before the storm. The storm arrived on a Tuesday morning in the form of a certified letter. The envelope was thick, heavy with finality. My hands trembled as I opened it. It was a divorce petition. But as I read, my breath caught in my throat. This wasn't just a divorce. It was an annihilation. David wasn't suing for divorce on the grounds of irreconcilable differences. He was suing for divorce on the grounds of adultery. And he was petitioning for full physical and legal custody of our children. The attached affidavit was a masterpiece of destruction. It contained everything I knew. He had the financial records, the credit card statements, but it also contained things I never imagined. There were printed copies of text messages between Ethan and me recovered from a cloud backup linked to my tablet, which I had forgotten he had access to. There were photographs taken by a private investigator of us entering the hotel, having coffee, walking in the park. They were clean, but they painted a damning picture of a secret life. The most devastating blow, however, was a series of email exchanges. David had created a fake email account posing as me. He had engaged Ethan in conversation, skillfully luring him into making shockingly callous statements. In these emails, I had expressed worries about the children finding out. Ethan's responses, which David had preserved with perfect clarity, were brutal. He had written things like, "Kids are resilient, they'll get over it," and "David sounds like a bore anyway. They're probably used to him not being around." One line made me physically ill. "We deserve happiness, Sarah. Don't let your guilt about a life you didn't even choose hold you back." David had presented this portfolio as evidence that I was an unfit mother. He argued that my affair demonstrated a profound lack of judgment and moral character. He used Ethan's emails to prove I was involved with a man who had a blatant disregard for the well-being of my children. The petition stated that my actions had created an unstable and morally corrosive environment, and that the children's best interest was to reside primarily with their father. I collapsed onto the kitchen floor, the papers scattering around me. This was his revenge, not a crime of passion, but a premeditated legal execution. He had known for months. His kindness, his suggestion of therapy, his entire performance of a man trying to reconcile, it was all a ruse to gather evidence and lull me into a false sense of security. He had allowed me to believe I was navigating the situation, when all the while he was leading me directly into a trap. I hired a lawyer, but it was futile. After reviewing the evidence, her face fell. "Sarah," she said gently, If we go to court, you will lose. He has an overwhelming case for custody. Your best option is to settle. You need to agree to his terms. The divorce was finalized with brutal efficiency. I agreed to his terms. I received limited visitation every other weekend and one dinner during the week. The family home was sold. After the division of assets, heavily skewed in his favor to support the children's primary residence, I was left with just enough to rent a small, sterile apartment. The picture-perfect life was shattered.